In Ukraine, 35,000 women receive compensation for their spouses who died of Chernobyl documented exposures.
In the way we designed it, the big winners here are the middle class. The middle class, if you are paying an individual and buying insurance on the exchange as an individual now, what we estimate, if you take a middle-class family with an income of $60,000, they're going to save over $8,000 a year.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Plans for the global climate strike are progressing. In Connecticut, demonstrations on September 20th will take place at noon at the Capitol in Hartford and at 3 p.m. on the New Haven Green. The first U.S. union to endorse the global climate strike is the United Electrical Workers. They did so at their national convention. There they heard from Vashini Prakash, a leader of the Sunrise Movement. On August 29th, the New Haven Climate Movement and Unidad Latina en Acción protested the burning of the Amazon and the mistreatment of the indigenous people there with a demonstration where they held signs in front of the Brazilian consulate in Hartford. They tried to deliver a letter to the Brazilian government, but security guards refused to take it. The amazing teen climate activist Greta Thunberg has arrived in the United States after traveling for 2 weeks in a wind and solar-powered sailboat. Hundreds cheered her in New York City. In Syria, the city of Khan Sheikhoun, which several years ago was the scene of an Assadist poison gas attack, fell to Assad troops. Now, Marat Neumann is being bombed mercilessly. The pediatric and gynecological hospital there was wrecked with 4 bombs. Still, as we see in this video grabbed from Twitter on August 30th of people with revolutionary flags, the revolution is still not all defeated. This month, the big radioactive news was about the explosion of the Russian reactor. Last month, it was about Chernobyl, the TV series. The HBO series of programs shocked millions. Yet if you go to the website of the International Atomic Energy Agency, their count of deaths from the accident at Chernobyl is under 50. Years ago, they published a definitive report which said estimates of people whose lives will be shortened by the radioactivity is under 4,000. This week, Democracy Now! Interviewed MIT professor Kate Brown, and she disputed those numbers and said the effects of the accident were far, far worse than the numbers being reported by authorities.
We're speaking to Kate Brown, professor of science, technology, and society at MIT, specializing in environmental and nuclear history. Her new book, Manuals for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future. So, Kate Brown, talk about what we should understand, the greatest misconceptions and the most important facts we should understand about what happened in Chernobyl in 1986 and why it's still relevant today.
Yeah, you know, we feel like we know a lot about Chernobyl, and that's what I thought when I started this project. And I worked my way through 27 archives and talked to 36 scientists and farmers and people who were, worked with the Chernobyl accident. And I followed biologists around the Chernobyl zone who worked there twice a year. And after about 5 years of research, I realized that much of what we know about Chernobyl is just either incomplete or fully incorrect. For example, we think of there's just one Chernobyl zone. Tourists stream in there every day, But what few people know is that there's a second Chernobyl zone that's nearly as radioactive as the first Chernobyl zone. It's in southern Belarus, and it was created because a couple days after the accident, Moscow leaders realized that a big storm front was brewing, and it was heading northeast towards several large Russian cities, including Moscow. So they sent up pilots, and the pilots manipulated the weather so it rained radioactive fallout on rural Belarus to save the big Russian cities. Now, this successful triage operation probably prevented the exposure of millions of urban dwellers, but at the same time, they didn't tell anyone in Belarus, not even the Belarusian Communist Party leader, that they had done this. So people lived in about 200,000 people in these rural areas in southern Belarus in terrifically raging hot conditions of radioactivity. Another misconception we have about the Chernobyl zone is that about 300 people were hospitalized. These are mostly nuclear plant operators and firefighters. That was only one count from one hospital. What I found working through the archives is that 40,000 people, with 11,000 of them being children, streamed into hospitals in the summer after the accident for Chernobyl-related exposures. Especially people in the southern territory of Belarus were wondering, what's going on? Why are my children fainting? Why are they nauseous or have dizzy spells? Why can't all of us get out of bed in the morning? So that's another misconception is, what kind of fatalities? If you look at UN records, they say from 35 to 54 people died from Chernobyl exposures. They project that in the future, 4,000 people might die of cancers. What I found is that Belarus and Russia, where most of Chernobyl radioactivity went, have not been brave enough to make a count, but that in Ukraine, 35,000 women receive compensation for their spouses who died of Chernobyl documented exposures. Now, these are just men who died. These are not children. No, the count doesn't include women. It doesn't account anybody who wasn't married. Off the record and at the Chernobyl Visitor Center, they give a number of 150,000 Ukrainians dead from Chernobyl exposures. Not 35, but the number is at least 35,000.
I want to read from your
finally,
book. Go ahead.
We might wonder, why is there no real conclusive science? We know a lot about high doses of radioactivity and what that does to humans. That's just like at that accident that just happened in Russia on August 8th. People die from acute radiation poisoning. That is easy to detect. It's fully documented. And we have a big study from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. But what scientists will tell you today is we really don't know what happens to people exposed to low doses of radioactivity chronically over long periods of time. And that's the Chernobyl syndrome, right? And this is far more likely, let's hope in the future, that people will not be exposed to nuclear bombs again, but that we probably will have on this globe more nuclear accidents at nuclear power plants. We have dozens of power plants that are over 40 years old that are operating. So we need to know what happens when people are exposed in a Chernobyl-like situation to a slow drip of low doses of radioactivity. And what I found working through the agricultural records in the Soviet archives is that quickly radioactivity saturated the food chain. It was in the wheat, tea, honey, milk, meat.
We don't have time to show it, so we'll skip the section where Brown describes Soviet authorities in '86 trying to send off radioactive meat for use by the provinces outside of Moscow.
1990, the Soviet Union was falling apart. Lots of people were upset about Chernobyl. And Moscow officials asked UN agencies to come in and do an independent assessment by foreign experts. Tell us what happened. First, the World Health Organization went in. Three scientists spent 10 days visiting contaminated and populated areas. They came away and said, there's no problem. You could double or triple the dose. There's no problem. They were looking at Hiroshima, extrapolating to Chernobyl, and said, according to our computation analysis, we don't see any problem. Nobody believed the World Health Organization's 10-day assessment. And so Moscow asked the International Atomic Energy Agency to go in. You tell us, give us an assessment of how high the doses are and whether people should be are in harm of further damage. International Atomic Energy Agency got 200 scientists to go in over 18 months. They mostly just short trips, 2 weeks, 10 days. And they were approached by doctors, Ukrainians and Belarusians mostly, who are on the ground, who have been working for the previous 4 years with these contaminated populations. And they said, look, we have a serious problem with childhood thyroid cancer. The Western experts didn't believe it. They didn't expect this kind of bump, epidemic in childhood cancer. And so the Ukrainian scientists gave them biopsies of children from their thyroids. They brought them home. The Western scientists, the thyroid cancer is checked out. But in their big report they wrote in 1991, they omitted that information from the report. They said there were rumors of childhood thyroid cancer, but they were anecdotal in nature. And this is unfortunately what I found working my way through UN archives, is that a few key UN scientists and administrators worked to diminish the story of a public health crisis occurring in the Chernobyl contaminated lands. They dismissed about most of the research that came in from on the ground from Ukraine and Belarus by scientists and doctors. And they hid these biopsies and kept repeating over and over again, there's no need for Chernobyl aid, there's no need for a big long-term health study on the level of the atomic bomb survivor studies. So that's why to this day, when people tell you we have no evidence that low doses of exposure cause harm to human health, that's because that big study was never done. There is no real evidence.
We skip a section about the non-fatal bad health effects of radiation.
Before we break, I want to ask you about the push by some saying nuclear power is the answer in the climate crisis to the reliance on oil and gas.
Yes. If we're going to fully replace fossil fuels, we will have to build 12,000 new reactors around the globe. There are about 400 now. So that's a big upscale in nuclear power. There will have to be nuclear power stations outside of every major population point. Now, there's all kinds of problems with cost versus renewables, but the thing that most keeps me up at night is the health effects. We really don't know what the health effects are for sure. This is heavily disputed. There's been no big study. The Chernobyl records show that health effects at low doses of radioactivity are severe and that they run through a population, causing people to feel, before they die, before they get cancers, before they're reported as acute effects, the subacute effects cause people to have a sort of a full bouquet of health problems that make life just miserable on a daily level.
And finally, Professor Brown,
productivity quite low.
We just have 30.
Makes the joy of living.
We just have 30 seconds, but I wanted to ask if you feel, it could happen here in the United States.
Yes, I'm afraid that not only could it happen here, but in fact it already has happened here. Our biggest nuclear power plant in Hanford, power plant in eastern Ukraine, in eastern Washington state, spilled 350 million curies of radioactive waste into the surrounding environment during Cold War production of nuclear arms. We're the only country in the world that tested nuclear bombs in our heartland in Nevada. Those 100 nuclear weapons that were blown up on the American continent spread billions, not millions like in Chernobyl, but billions of curies of radioactive waste around the American country. And so we have hotspots of radioactivity in Tennessee and Chicago area that were as high as near Nevada. And what we have is a public health crisis that we have not yet fully addressed. We have rising rates of thyroid cancer, rising rates of pediatric cancers, which used to be, in the 1930s, a medical rarity.
We urge you to go to YouTube, to the Democracy Now! Channel, and view all the segments about Kate Brown last week on the show. Now, news about 7 anti-nuclear activists headed for a trial in October, the Plowshares 7.
A federal judge rejected a request to dismiss their charges. The activists were arrested in April 2018 after they secretly entered the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base in Georgia, armed with hammers, crime scene tape, and baby bottles containing their own blood. The activists, who are known as the Bay Plowshares, face up to 25 years in prison. Earlier this week, a judge rejected their attempt to cite the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as part of their defense. Bay Plowshare defendant Patrick O'Neill appeared on Democracy Now! Earlier this year to talk about their novel defense.
You have to have a religious belief that is sincerely held, and you also have to show that you've been burdened by the government's reaction to what you've done, and that this burden is limiting your practice of your religion. Our whole religious symbolism going into the base was clear. It was documented in our statement. It was documented by the blood. It was documented by Scripture, by the Bible, by the spray painting of the religious Scripture quotes.
Go to democracynow.org to see our full coverage of the Bay Plowshares case. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
Here's a question for you. Which is more reckless, breaking into a nuclear sub-base or building nuclear power or nuclear weapons? Incidentally, Bloomberg News had a piece about the lab of Marie Curie, which is located in Acuel, a village south of Paris. Curie, as you may recall, was the discoverer of many radioactive elements. Her lab closed in 1978, but it's brimming with radioactivity. Some call it Chernobyl on the Seine. It will be a health threat for millennia. We now go back to the Medicare for All conference held recently in Hamden, Connecticut. We were listening to UMass economist Robert Pollin explain that now, even after years of Obamacare, 35% of Americans either have no insurance or are underinsured, meaning they have insurance, but the deductibles and such are ridiculously high. He also said that the U.S. spends twice as much per capita on health care as do other prosperous countries. Poland explained if we go to Medicare for all, health care expenses for the countries will increase because millions more will be in the system. But there'll be huge savings because we will be getting rid of the health insurance companies.
Now, if you look, and this is strict, official government data, private health insurance expenditures on, quote, administration, which means a lot of paper shuffling, a lot of credentialing, a lot of denials, work to deny people, and then, of course, profits, and, of course, advertising. Now, that adds up to 12% of their costs. Now, then you compare it with the public Medicare, our existing Medicare system, it's 2%. 12% versus 2%. Well, when you're talking about a $3.5 trillion system, that 10 percentage points of cost is massive. We're talking about $2 trillion here. So we are going to get those savings from eliminating all the useless administrative activity and the advertising and the excessive profits that Shanna was just talking about. That's the first big source of saving. The second big source of saving is with pharmaceutical prices. If you look at other economies, there's really, again, there's no debate. The other countries in the Western European countries, Japan, Australia, Canada, they're spending roughly half of what we're spending on pharmaceuticals, on prescription drugs. Half. And they're mostly the same exact drugs. Spending half, because in this country we don't use the power of the government to bargain down prices, whereas they do in the other countries. So there are other sources of savings, but those are going to be the two big ones. When we add it up, we estimate, I would argue again conservatively, you get almost 20% less costs per person than you do under our existing system. Medicare for All builds in these massive costs. And so the net result is we can get universal coverage, everybody has free access to the system, no barriers in terms of cost sharing, and we save about 9% overall. That, and again, is a conservative estimate, because conservative in the sense that we would still be paying significantly more relative to what other countries are paying. I'm not saying we're going to look exactly like Canada. I'm saying we're going to go maybe a third of the way to where Canada is, and we still get massive savings. So that's the key. Now, what does it mean in terms of how individuals pay for this and businesses? Well, there's different ways you can think about financing the system, but in the way we did it, we said, look, businesses are already used to paying premiums. And by the way, this notion, I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute, this notion that people can't conceive of giving up their private health care that they get from their private business. Private businesses are changing their health care, private insurers, all the time. 17% of private businesses change per year. So this is no big deal to then do a one-time transfer to Medicare for all. Now, if they do that in the way we designed it, all the private businesses that are covering their workers today, they would all pay 8% less than they pay now. So in other words, if a private business is paying $1 million per year to cover its workers, tomorrow when Medicare for All starts, they're going to pay $920,000. From $1 million to $920,000. I think businesses like this idea. I know it's going to work for them. Now, what about households? In the way we designed it, the big winners here are the middle class. The middle class, if you are paying individual and buying insurance on the exchange as an individual now, what we estimate, if you take a middle class family with an income of $60,000, they're going to save over $8,000 a year. This is a 14% savings, giving people a 14% improvement in their net income, in their living standard. This is a massive benefit. So this notion that people can't conceive of giving up their private health care when they're going to save $14,000 and have universal care and not have to worry at all about co-pays, deductibles, getting sick, losing their jobs, not being able to change jobs, this is a massive benefit. So let me just address quickly the two of the big political questions that have come up in the campaign. The first is this thing, oh, how the hell are you going to pay for this? How? And Biden keeps bringing this up. Biden says, do you realize that Medicare for All is going to cost $3 trillion? Yes. Do you realize, Mr. Former Vice President, that our current system costs $3.5 trillion? That's the part that he leaves out. He's right to say it'll cost $3 trillion or thereabouts. He's only telling you a bit of the story, because what he doesn't tell you is that it's going to save $400 billion relative to our existing system. It's cheaper. So every time you hear Biden or any other candidate say, my God, this is going to cost $3 trillion, your response has to be right, and that is $400 billion less than we're paying now. So that's the big one. Now, the other big one that I've heard of the campaign is that 150 million people have private health insurance through their employer, which they do, and they want to keep it because they like it. I don't believe that. I believe what people like is having guaranteed health care, being able to see the provider that they want, and not going bankrupt or not being able to get the care they want. So here's the question you asked. Not the question, do you like who your private insurer is? The question is, do you want to have a healthcare system in which you are guaranteed for life? Your children, your family are guaranteed to life to have decent health care at lower costs, that you can see the provider that you want to see. You are always guaranteed. You will not be inhibited by your health insurer as to which providers you can see. Do you want that kind of a system? The answer is inevitably yes. And when you ask the question, do you want Medicare for all, and people connect with these benefits of Medicare for all, the answer 75% of the time is yes. So Medicare for all is a viable system. It is a system that has proven to work in other countries. We can build on the successes in other countries. We can create a system which is truly transformative in the sense that it makes healthcare a human right, period. Thank you.
Appearing via the internet, Richard Escow, talking about the healthcare for-profit industry where he used to work.
My name is Richard Escow, and you probably have my bio in front of you. And I assume you all see me on some large screen like the aliens who communicated to Captain Kirk and Star Trek, where I'm just on a big screen or something. So, good. I come from a friendly civilization. But I want to talk about a less friendly civilization, because I want to talk about the world that I used to function in, which is the world of for-profit healthcare, which I left about 15 years ago for the lucrative world of left-wing writing and activism. So just to give you a little background in my experience with the for-profit healthcare world, I started out as kind of a technical whiz kid working for an HMO in the Bay Area many years ago, more than 35 years ago. So working with computers and, you know, the new technology, and there weren't too many people doing that. I got hired by our software vendor, so I actually designed computer systems for health plans and insurance companies, which is a good way to learn how they work from the inside. And so I did that for a while. Then I got hired by AIG, which was kind of the parent company. Well, they actually bought the company I was working for, so I was really in the middle of it, and became, you know, at a pretty young age, considered one of the first managed care experts. I should start by saying, you know, I knew a lot of very nice people in that world, in the healthcare world. It's not that people are individually venal or evil, but there's a moral blind spot.
We're about done. If you have ideas on how to spread the word about the global climate strike on September 20th, let us know. Send us video, mail@thestruggle.org. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.